Welcome, Mishpocha, to Tikvah Radio Show, the sound of hope. I'm your host, Liliana Inez, and I'm so glad you joined us. In this program, we want to share with you some wonderful stories of Jewish people who've had amazing encounters with the Messiah of Israel. At times, we will play some original songs from our band Tapestry of Praise. My husband Denny and I make our home in California and love to write songs based on the Jewish scriptures. Songs of hope, shalom, joy, and comfort. Many of these songs are part of our personal experience of God's touch and care in our lives. We will also be sharing some thoughts and teachings using the eternal words of Adonai that bring hope and change in our lives. If you would like to purchase our album or individual songs, you can find us on CD Baby and iTunes under Tapestry of Praise. Our albums are California Gold, Wall of Fire, and Tikvah. Now, on to our interview. Welcome, Mishpacha. Today our guest is Ron Davis. Ron had a successful career as a high school psychologist. Nowadays, Ron shares his passion for the Messiah. He also has a heart to teach the Christian community the importance of understanding and honoring Israel and the Jewish people. Ron feels that both Israel and the Jewish people are under attack in our time. We're so glad to have you here with us, Ron.
Well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Ron, you were originally from Brooklyn, New York. What was your life like there in Brooklyn?
Yeah, well, I was born in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, which today is a very Orthodox section of Brooklyn. In fact, I was just there a couple of weeks ago. But we lived, just by way of a little bit of family background, we lived in a little apartment above Siegel's grocery store there in Brooklyn, New York. My grandparents were all Jewish immigrants who came to America from Russia and from Lithuania and Poland. And they all spoke primarily Yiddish when they came here, in addition to whatever their native languages were, Polish or Russian and so on. They had no money when they came. There was no family here ahead of them when they came here. They all came through Ellis Island, and they settled in Brooklyn. And my life, as I was growing up as a young boy, my experience was that of basically living in a Jewish neighborhood, a very Jewish lifestyle in a very Jewish neighborhood. All of my friends were Jewish. The public school I went to was predominantly Jewish. It even closed on the High Holy Days. My grandfather and my father actually owned a kosher butcher shop there in Brooklyn. My mom stayed home with me. I guess I was a handful, so she had to stay home. Of course, moms didn't go out and work much in those days, but she would shop in a number of Jewish markets in the area. Of course, meat had to be separated from the dairy, so you had a butcher shop, but that wasn't a problem for us. But she would buy her dairy in another place. She would buy her bakery goods in another place. And we were basically three generations of Jews living a very Jewish lifestyle in New York until my family began this great migration west to California. And even then, when we were in California, it seemed as if we found all of the Jewish transplants from New York. I can remember going with my father as a kid to the store or the drugstore, and he was always bumping into somebody he knew who lived, in the Prospect Park area, or that he knew from the Navy, and so there was a lot of New York who came to California in those days. And we were able to maintain the kinds of friendships and the lifestyle that we were accustomed to. You know, we had our friends, or I should say my parents had their friends, Murray and Gladys, and Sam and Estelle, and Herbie and Vina. And, you know, they just maintained that lifestyle, very, very Jewish. But nevertheless, I would say that some things did change. You know, and when we got to California, and we finally, my dad bought one of those post-World War II homes in an area that was called Dairy Valley, and ironically, the name of the street, which he didn't know when he bought the house because it was all dirt roads and wood frames going up at the time, the name of the street was Flatbush Avenue. So I moved from New York and lived on Flatbush Avenue in California. Now, our neighborhood, though, was anything but Jewish.
Yeah.
None of my friends or any of the kids that I played with in the neighborhood were Jewish. You know, although I had some good friends, but I also experienced a certain amount of anti-Semitism, I would say, growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. And I learned at a very young age, at that point, having left New York, that there were two groups of people, two people groups. There was us and them. And there were a lot of times when I had to take different routes home from school. The school I went to was only about 4 blocks from home, maybe about a 10 or 12-minute walk. But there were times I had to take a different route to avoid getting beaten up because I was Jewish.
Wow.
And this was my first encounter, I think, with quote-unquote Christians. And
not a good
prior to that, pardon me?
Not a good encounter, not a good experience, yeah. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, it wasn't good to that extent. I mean, I didn't know anything about anti-Semitism, really, at that point, having been a transplant from New York. Only that these kids didn't like Jews, and they didn't like me because I was Jewish. Yeah. And they would call me names. Like, for example, they would call me a dirty Jew, or they would call me a Christ killer. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time. Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't a part of my knowledge base, wasn't a part of my vocabulary. These are the first times I had ever heard these things. And interestingly, my education with regard to my Jewish identity took a step further when I think I was probably about 10 years old. And back in those days, you know, the late 50s, we would play marbles a lot. And when I was playing with one of my friends, and we were down on the ground, and when he leaned forward to shoot one of his marbles, a little chain fell out of his T-shirt. And it had a cross and a little man on the cross. And my friend's name was Buddy. And I asked Buddy, you know, what that was. And he kind of looked at me, you know, a little funny, you know, as if, how in the world did you not know what this is? You know, as if I was supposed to know. And, you know, he said with a certain amount of incredulity, I think, it's a crucifix. And I still didn't know what it was. Right. And he said, it's Jesus. And I still didn't know what it was. Right. And so when I got home, I asked my Jewish mother if I could have one of those things just like Buddy. And so...
What was her reaction?
Well, after she picked herself up off of the floor, you know, yeah, she told me no, I couldn't. Okay. You know, and I asked her why, and she told me he's not for you. And... you know, for a kid, having those words from his mother, I mean, that was fine. That was good enough for me that she said he's not for you. But what's interesting is that, you know, here, unbeknownst to me and really unbeknownst to her, as well, although she knew more about Jesus than I did. But here is the Jewish Messiah spoken of by the Jewish prophets in the Jewish scriptures given to the Jewish people that, our prophets, Prophet Jeremiah had told our people that God was going to make a new covenant with them. Paul, who many believe was the founder of Christianity, was really anything but. He was the one who said that this good news of the Messiah was to be to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. Part of the calling of the Jewish people was always to bring the knowledge of God to the nations. And so it's kind of ironic that, that I would be told, it's ironic and sad, I guess, at the same time, that I would be told he's not for you.
Yeah.
But that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
It was us and them. And
can I ask you something really quick, Ron? Now, going back to Brooklyn, New York, you're raised with your grandparents. You've got this 3-generation thing going, which is really neat to have that. Nowadays, we don't have the 3 generations under the same roof or nearby. Families are scattered and everything. And your grandparents were originally from Eastern Europe, is that correct?
Yeah, they would have been from what we know in Eastern Europe as the Pale of Settlement. My grandparents on my dad's side were from Russia, and my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandfather was from Lithuania, and my grandmother was from Poland. In fact, my grandmother's father, which would have been my great-grandfather, was a chief rabbi, and so all of our ancestors, going back as far as I can trace, which that's about as far as I can trace. Because we lived in the diaspora and were, chased from, one place to the next.
Yes.
Very, very Jewish, very Orthodox. My grandfather on my mother's side was a very humble man, very Orthodox, always praying, always davening, reading the scriptures, studying the Talmud. I remember many times I would stop over as I got older, as I was an adult and I could drive. I would pop into their home and I would say hello, and he would be in the second bedroom of the house, which was really like his prayer closet. And, he would say hello, and then he would go back on to his prayers. But that is, kind of the environment that I grew up in. Jewish identity, was very, very important. And as far as the Jewish people are concerned, I would say we're kind of, as what I've told you so far in my story, kind of leads to the fact, and the fact that my mom told me at first opportunity that Jesus was not for me, goes to the understanding that Jewish people are pre-offended, by Jesus, by the gospel, that it's not for me. And, as we were growing up in California, it was probably kind of a cross between being traditional, because they had kind of moved away from the orthodoxy that we had back in New York, or that my grandparents even maintained. Uh-huh. But it was kind of a cross between being traditional and, part of our lives were very secular as we lived in a very non-Jewish area.
So the atmosphere really changed how your religion went, your Jewish religion went. So that's what I wanted to ask you. So you were raised Orthodox. You even had a chief rabbi in your background.
Yeah, I wasn't raised Orthodox, although, it was as if my grandparents maintained the orthodoxy for me in our lives. But, I wasn't very religious, but I nevertheless felt guilty about what I didn't believe.
So you believed in God? Did you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
Yeah, well, I knew something of that. I mean, I went to Hebrew school, but I believed it to the extent that a traditional or a secular Jew, I was probably more agnostic over the whole issue. Being Jewish is really more than what you believe, in a sense. It's a part of your community identity. And, you know, you can cross the line of that community identity, and when you cross that line, you're out. And so I had a strong sense, even though it may have not been a religious sense, there was a certain amount of tradition involved in who we were. There was definitely a very strong identity in who we were and where I came from. And Israel now being a state, there was a strong identity with our Jewish state. And so, you know, that's kind of where I was in my life. And when my mother said, "He's not for you," and it just kind of fortified and galvanized that thought that there was the us and them. There were Jews and Christians, and if you weren't a Jew, then you were a Christian, and that was the extent of my understanding. I mean, there weren't a lot of other people groups at the time. There were Jews and non-Jews predominantly. You know, I didn't run into a lot of Buddhists or Hindus or, you know, any of that. So you were either a Jew or a Christian. And, you know, I use the term Christian defined loosely here. But the world was divided into us and them, and at least that was my understanding. You know, of course, I didn't understand too much of what I did understand. Yeah. But it stayed that way, you know, through all of my growing up years. And the one thing I knew for sure as a Jew, that Jews don't believe in Jesus. Yeah, I wasn't pursuing any kind of a personal relationship with God, you know, and having the understanding that I'm Jewish and this Jesus and Christianity is something separate and apart from us, even though in the first century all of the believers were Jews in the beginning. And they were a little confused in the first century as to what to do with all these Gentiles who started coming to the faith.
You're talking about the Jewish people that came to faith and came to believe in Yeshua as the Messiah in the first century, that they were all Jewish.
Right. Right. In the first century, they're predominantly Jewish. It took a decade or two for this to kind of move toward Gentiles coming into the faith. I grew up with the understanding that believing in Jesus was the equivalent of committing ethnic suicide. And so becoming a believer, to me, meant joining the other side.
Right.
You know, it was like the persecuted joining the persecutors. It meant giving up your Jewish identity, because you can't be a Jew and a Christian at the same time. Right. You know, the Jewish community said so, and Christianity said so as well. You know, the Jewish community would say, basically, okay, if that's what you want to believe, then you go over there, you're now a Christian, even though I would say, no, I'm still Jewish. And Christianity would kind of welcome us with open arms, and they'd say, welcome into the family, but they would also say, you're now a Christian, and they would kind of push my Jewishness off, and I have to say to them, I'm still Jewish. And, you know, the words of my mother actually stuck with me until I was 26 years old, which was in 1975.
So during your teen years and as a young adult, there was no changes. You took what the Jewish community said to you to heart. Your mom said Jesus is not for you, and that was a done deal. And so there was nothing interesting or important as far as your relationship with God or your thoughts about Messiah, or so nothing key happened during your teen or young adult time. Is that correct?
No, not really, you know, except I would have friends from time to time, you know, who would say, why don't you believe in Jesus? You know, he's your Messiah. But they couldn't really get beyond that in any kind of a witness that was credible or effective. I had one of my best friends that I graduated college with. He was Italian Catholic and an unbeliever, and I was Jewish and not a believer at the time. And he would say those things to me. And I remember when I became a believer, I went to him and I said, "Hey, Sammy, I got something to tell you. I have become a follower of Yeshua, of Jesus." And he said, "That's nice. What about the church?" And I said to him, what do you mean, what about the church? And he said, "What about the Holy Roman Catholic Church?" And I remember saying to him, "What are you talking to me about the Catholic Church? I'm talking to you about the person of the Messiah." And I realized at that point that he was not a believer, even though he identified, so to speak, with Christianity. He was really not a believer. And we had kind of a tense couple of years there. And he finally, I'm glad to say, he came to the Lord. And not only did he come to the Lord, but he came to a really an understanding of the Jewish roots of his faith, both he and his wife. And it has filtered down to some of his family. And that has been a good thing, that the Lord worked out in that. But actually, up until that time, nothing really changed. I just kind of went through my life as anybody else would, building a career, going to college, going to work, raising a family. And, it wasn't until 1975 that things changed.
So what happened? What happened?
Well, it was then that I received my first credible witness concerning Jesus, and from, of all people, you would never guess who it was from, but it was from my mother.
Wow.
How
did that happen? that is incredible. She's the one that said, Jesus is not for you. What happened to your mom?
She told me to disregard everything she ever told me about Jesus. Just to give you a little bit of background on that, my mother had been very sick for a number of years, and she was on constant pain medication. And I had noticed in the last couple of weeks that she seemed to be pretty happy, had a bounce back in her step. She didn't seem to be in pain. And I remember we were over one night, for dinner, and she said, "I have something to tell you." And she said to me, "You've heard of Hebrew Christians, right?" And I remember saying to her, "No, that sounds like an oxymoron to me." And she said, "Well, your father and I are Hebrew Christians. We accepted Jesus, and his name is Yeshua."
Wow.
And, you could have just knocked me over with a feather. It was like, I had a couple of thoughts. One was, first, I thought you told me he's not for us. And, secondly, I was thinking, just racing through my mind, well, if you believe that, what does that make me? And, they really, this is the reverse of what usually happens. What usually happens is the young kid or a young adult comes to his parents and says, "Mom, Dad, sit down, I have something to tell you." And they deprived me of the right to say that, and they gave it to me first.
So your mom, what happened to your mom? So she's sick, and do you know specifically what happened to her?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because she was sick, and when she was presented with this witness about Jesus being the Messiah, she said, "I'll have to have a sign before I believe that." And she was healed immediately. Nobody prayed for her to be healed. She didn't ask to be healed. She just said, "I'll have to have a sign."
That's awesome. And so she asked God for a sign, or she told that to a Christian friend? Did she?
Pardon me?
So she asked God for a sign, or did she about the Messiah, or did she tell a Christian friend or something that she wanted a sign from God that he was the Messiah?
No, none of that. In fact, she didn't even ask God for anything. She just said, kind of in general, I'll have a sign before I believe in anything like that. Wow. And God healed her. And the bottles of her medication stayed on the windowsill from that day onward never to be touched again.
Wow.
And so
and she knew in her heart that God had healed her, and that was his answer about the Messiah.
Well, she connected those two things, and that she started delving into Scripture herself, and my father did also.
Wow.
And I would say that what really persuaded me more than anything was the fact that my father believed it. I mean, he was a tough kid growing up on the streets of Brooklyn, and I said, "Dad, you believe this?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "It's true. I think it's true." And so she asked me if she could read me a prophecy out of the Bible.
Wow.
And we had never been focused on any of these kinds of things in the past. We're certainly not taught about these things in Hebrew school. And so I told her it had to be out of my Bible. And she said, "It's from Isaiah, the 53rd chapter." And I said, "Is that in my Bible?" That's how much I knew. And so she read it, and she asked me, "Who does that sound like?" And I said, "Well, it sounds like Jesus. What's he doing in my Bible?" And so they had taken me about as far as they could take me, because they had only been believers, for a couple of weeks. They took me through some prophetic passages. They introduced me to Isaiah 53, to the 22nd Psalm, to passages in Genesis, and I began my own personal investigation. And they said, "You have to go talk to this guy." There was a Jewish believer who was running a Jewish ministry, a little Jewish ministry, not far from where I worked, actually. And he had a PhD from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and was a Jewish believer. And I figured, well, I'm a college graduate, and I can tangle hibum in a pretzel in, short work. And so I went there for a certain amount of debate and arguing, which was what was in my mind. And after a number of weeks, a couple of months of studying the Hebrew Scriptures, and I went there just about every day to argue with him, and looking through many prophecies, prophetic Scripture, and especially going into Isaiah 53, it appeared that if anybody was going to be the promised Jewish Messiah, it would have to be Yeshua. It would have to be Jesus.
Wow. That's awesome.
So on July 24th, 1975, I became a believer and came to accept him as my personal Messiah and Savior through that Hebrew Christian ministry. That's what they were called back then in the 70s. It wasn't really a Messianic Jewish movement yet. But I became involved in Messianic Jewish ministry ever since that time, over the past 40-plus years.
How did your life change when you received Messiah? Did you notice something happen right away? What do you...
Well, it's a little funny, because I remember leaving that place that day, feeling somewhat like a load had been lifted off of me. I didn't have the full appreciation of all of what had just transpired, but I knew I had made a commitment that this was something that I now believed. And so, I started reading the Scriptures from a different perspective. I started reading it rather than disproving that he's the Messiah. I started reading it, from the prospect of learning as much as I could about him. And God showed me things really in the Scripture that I had no basis for understanding. And so it was almost as if the Spirit was moving me along and teaching me things. And I just started to grow in the Lord. And I attended Bible studies. I studied more. I started reading more than I probably had ever read in my life, even going through 4 years of college. And ultimately, I teamed up with a couple of other buddies of mine who were also Jewish believers. One of them is still a really close friend who lives on Long Island, in New York, and we started the first Messianic congregation in Orange County here in California, and served as an elder and part of the leadership in that congregation. And then several years later, we started another Messianic congregation, and I also served as an elder and a leader in that congregation in a position of teaching.
So how do you see yourself now than how you saw yourself before you received Messiah? How did Messiah change your life?
Well, I think he changed my life by pulling me out of, gradually, step by step, pulling me out of a lifestyle that was, very me-centered, very probably more materialistic than I am today, bringing me to a place of really focusing on God and walking with God and looking at the attributes of God and constant relationship of reading the scriptures and learning of God and being able to, communicate those things to other people, and especially to my Jewish people who don't believe, as I did at one time, that Jesus is the Messiah.
When you have challenges in your life, what does Messiah do for you?
Well, we're all challenged with difficulties in life. When you come to faith and believe in the Messiah, all of your troubles don't go away. He doesn't take you out of the troubles. He's with you in the troubles. There is a God out there. I didn't have to be agnostic anymore. I know for sure. And that, we will meet him one day. He came once for the purpose of forgiving our sin, and I focus on that constantly, and the fact that we have the hope that he promised he is going to return, and he'll establish his kingdom. He will establish that kingdom as he promised Israel.
So why should a Jewish person consider Yeshua as the Messiah, as the Jewish Messiah?
Yeah. Well, I had that conversation with a number of Jewish people back in New York just a couple of weeks ago, and they should consider Jesus, Yeshua, as the Jewish Messiah, because there is no salvation in any other name other than him. He is the atonement that Moses and the prophets all wrote about, the atonements that were all a practice of a part of Judaism in the Hebrew scriptures, finds its fulfillment in the person of the Messiah who was promised to Israel and who came and who had to suffer for the sins of the people and die, but he rose from the dead. And just as he promised that he would come the first time, he has promised that he will come back the second time, and he will establish his kingdom amongst Israel. There will be a salvation of Israel at that time, but in the meantime, Jewish people, one at a time, come to faith by coming to their Messiah, Yeshua.
Welcome back, Mishpacha. Let's turn to the book of Jeremiah in the Tanakh. Jeremiah was a Jewish prophet. He was the son of Hilkiah, a Cohen Jewish priest from the tribe of Benjamin. Jeremiah's name shows that he was chosen by God. It means Adonai has appointed. The difficulties he encountered are described in the books that he wrote, the book of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah was born during a troubled time in history, both for Israel and the world. Great nations were struggling for control of the world. The Assyrian Empire was diminishing. Babylon was a superpower. Assyria was losing power, and Egypt was still a superpower. This is around 600 BC. In the middle of all this was a little nation called Judah. It was located between two superpowers. When the armies from the Babylonian Empire in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley marched to fight the armies from the Egyptian Empire in the Nile Valley, they had to go through Judah. Many battles were fought on Judah's territory. Its people suffered greatly as a result. The kings of Judah were tempted to make alliances with either Babylon or Egypt. They were hoping for protection against the other one. Jeremiah and the other prophets kept warning Israel to trust in God only instead of these alliances. Isn't this still true today? We need to always look to Adonai, to trust Him above man, nations, and powers, because He's the only one that cares and loves us completely with a perfect love. And back to Jeremiah. At this time, spiritually, the people of Judah had sunk very low. After the death of good King Hezekiah, his wicked son Manasseh came to the throne. And this is written in 2 Kings chapter 21. Followed by his son Amon, also a wicked king, ruled, and that's again in chapter 21 of 2 Kings. When Amon died, his 8-year-old son Josiah was placed on the throne. Josiah was the last of the good kings of Judah. He led the people back to God and His law. He's an amazing example that no matter how young someone can be, they can be a great blessing if they're following God. And you can read his story in 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23. It was during the time of the rule of Josiah the king that Jeremiah was called by God to prophesy. You can read that calling in Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah shed many tears over the sins of his people. He was God's spokesman. He actually was called the weeping prophet. Although he did not fully succeed in turning the people back to God, his words still resonate nowadays. Words that speak about Adonai's faithfulness and love for Israel, his heart, and his thoughts as Israel being precious to him are still true today. And I encourage you to read his book. It will remind you that God is faithful and that his faithfulness doesn't come to an end. Now, in this following scripture, there is a wonderful word given to Jeremiah right in the midst of a very tough time for Israel. Israel was in the Babylonian captivity, which lasted around 70 years. And the prophet was crying and weeping before God for his nation. And at that point, God brought this word of comfort to him, not only for himself, but to speak it over his people. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 30 through 34. Here the days are coming, says Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand, and I brought them out of the land of Egypt, because they, for their part, violated my covenant, even though I, for my part, was a husband to them, says Adonai. For this is the covenant I make with the house of Israel after those days, says Adonai. I will put my Torah within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will any of them teach his fellow community member of or his brother know Adonai, for all will know me from the least of them to the greatest, because I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. This is what Adonai says, who gives the sun his light for the day, who ordained the laws for the moon and the stars to provide the light for the night, who stirs up the sea until its waves roar. Adonai Sabaoth is his name. A new covenant to put the Torah, to write it on the hearts of individuals. Many Torah teachers believe this is the most important scripture Jeremiah ever wrote. The nation of Israel had failed to live up to the terms of the Old Covenant. It was impossible because of their depravity. Jeremiah chapter 2 verses 12 through 13 says that the prophet pointed out over and over again to God's people that they had committed two serious sins. First, they had forsaken God, the fountain of living waters. And second, they had hewn out for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. A fountain of living water. A fountain of living water is a spring that always brings forth an abundant supply of fresh, clean water. This is Jeremiah describing Adonai as a constant source of blessings. However, a cistern has no water supply of its own. It's just a container of water. And a broken cistern would, of course, not be able to hold any water at all. And this is a picture of the people of Judah, who had come to trust in the idols of foreign nations, dead idols that could bring no blessing. Judah trusted in her own wisdom and strength. Jeremiah was saying that only the wisdom and strength of God was to be trusted. So the people of Judah trusted in empty things that had no power or value to help them. They were just like broken cisterns. Judah had rejected the true God who alone could bless her, and in God's place she trusted things that could bring no blessing at all. Even so, Jeremiah's preaching fell on deaf ears because the people had become very corrupt. Even the priests and prophets at that time, many of them, were also corrupt. Jeremiah pleaded for the people to return to God's way and walk in the old paths, the law of God, but they refused to hear. And it was at this time that God gave Jeremiah this new word, when Jeremiah prophesied that one day God would make a new covenant with his people. The old covenant proved that man was depraved, a depraved sinner, guilty in the eyes of a holy God, and unable to live up to the demands of the perfect law. Israel could not keep the law of the old covenant. Israel still cannot keep the law of the old covenant. There's no way anyone can keep the law, every single law. And there is no temple to take care of the sin issue. There's no longer a temple in Israel for the sacrifice. God knew that in order to restore Israel to himself, he would have to be the one to restore Israel by his own power. The covenant relies solely, this new covenant relies solely on God's mercy. God's continual grace in forgiving a disobedient people and calling them back into relationship with him. And he would send Israel, the promised Jewish Messiah, to do the work of the new covenant. In the book of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 28 in the New Testament, the new covenant, we read, "For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Sin brings sickness and destruction. God never created us, Mishpoha, to live that way. He created us for good things. Just like Jeremiah chapter 29:11 says, God has good plans for us, a future and a hope. When Messiah comes into our lives, he removes sin and brings restoration. Chapter 30:17 of Jeremiah reads, "For I will restore health to you, I will heal you of your wounds." It's a declaration of Adonai. Mishpoha, I've seen people addicted to drugs receive Messiah and be set free from their addiction and live a whole and healthy life. That's Adonai's heart for you. And that's Adonai's heart for all of us. It's because of the work of Yeshua that this is possible. The description of the Old Covenant and the work of the New Covenant can be read in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, or what others call the New Covenant. It's chapter 12, verses 18 through 24. I encourage you to read this for yourself. "For you have not come to a tangible mountain, to an ignited fire, to darkness, to murk, to a whirlwind, to the sound of a shofar, to a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further message be given to them. For they couldn't bear that what was being commanded of them. Quote, if even an animal touches a mountain, it is to be stoned to death, unquote. And so terrifying was the sight that Moshe himself said, I'm quaking with dread. On the contrary, you have come to Mount Zion, that is the city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels in festive assembly, to a community of the firstborn whose names have been recorded in heaven, to a judge who is God of everyone, to spirits of righteous people who have been brought to the goal, to the mediator of a new covenant, Yeshua, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks better things than that of Abel. That is our hope. The new covenant has brought us hope. Yeshua took care of the sin problem when he shed his blood on our behalf. He is the perfect Lamb, the perfect atonement. He not only cleanses us from our sin and restores us back to relationship with God, but he also gives us a new life. He is the healer, he is the restorer, and he's the one that can make all things new in your life. We're in the year 5778, and 8 is a number for new beginnings. And I will read you one last thing, and then you can listen to one of our songs called I Am, from the book of Isaiah 43. This last scripture describes what the Messiah will do for anyone who will receive him as their Savior. From the book of Isaiah, chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Thank you for listening to Tikvah Radio Show, the voice of hope. If you have been blessed by this program and want to join us in sharing with others the hope of Yeshua HaMashiach, a gift of any amount will be appreciated. You can donate and contact us on our website at tikvahradio.com. Once again, that's TIKVAH radio.com. Thank you for joining us, and God bless.